There comes a moment when a man realizes he has nothing left to lose. For Preston Whitmore, that moment came when he sat alone in his empty apartment, eviction notice in hand, wondering how his life had fallen apart so completely. Then a letter arrived about an inheritance, a massive 1700s castle in the European countryside. The locals called it cursed. They said tragedy followed anyone who entered. But Preston had nothing left, so he went anyway. The castle was vast and crumbling, filled with silence. Then he found a hidden door behind the old study. Behind it was a secret sanctuary his ancestor had built centuries ago. And inside, something alive that had survived in darkness all this time. But what living thing could have survived alone, sealed away for generations? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story is unforgettable. Preston Whitmore had been an architect once. Not just any architect, one of those rising stars people whispered about at industry conferences, the kind whose name appeared in design magazines alongside words like visionary and transformative. He'd specialized in historic preservation, breathing new life into buildings most people had written off as beyond saving. There was poetry in it, he used to think, finding the bones of something beautiful beneath decades of neglect and making it whole again. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. The collapse came swiftly, the way these things often do. A financial crisis rippled through the economy, and the firm he'd poured 15 years into went under in a matter of months. His marriage, already strained by long hours and obsessive dedication to his work, crumbled shortly after. His ex-wife had been kind about it, in her way. She'd simply said what they both knew. He'd married his buildings long before he'd married her. The divorce settlement took most of what little remained. Then the months of fruitless job searching, watching his savings evaporate, moving from his renovated brownstone to a cramped apartment, then to a cheaper one, then to the studio with water-stained ceiling tiles where the eviction notice finally found him. Preston had always believed that if you worked hard enough, if you were talented enough, things would work out. Sitting on the floor of that empty studio at 53 years old, he understood how naive that belief had been. The letter from the law firm arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded from 2 previous addresses. The envelope was heavy cream paper, the kind that suggested old money and older traditions. Preston almost threw it away, assuming it was another debt collection notice dressed up in formal clothing. Instead, he opened it. The words seemed impossible at first. Inheritance, estate, Ravencrest Castle. A distant relative named Cornelius Ashford, a branch of his mother's family he'd never heard mentioned. The genealogy was complex, tracing back through 7 generations to a common ancestor. But the conclusion was clear. Preston was the last living heir. There were conditions, of course. He had to take possession in person. He had to reside at the property for a minimum of 6 months before any sale could be considered. And there was the matter of the estate's location, a remote village in the European highlands, hours from the nearest city. The attorney's letter was matter-of-fact, almost apologetic. The property was old, likely in severe disrepair, and local complications made its value questionable. But it was his, if he wanted it. Preston read the letter 3 times. Then he looked around his empty studio, at the eviction notice on the counter, at the phone that had stopped ringing with job prospects months ago. He had exactly $417 in his bank account and nowhere to go. 2 weeks later, he stood in a cramped office in the village of Ravencrest, signing papers he barely understood, while a local attorney named Gregor Sundberg watched with weary patience. "You understand the property has been vacant for many years," Sundberg said in careful English. "The village maintains the grounds minimally, as required by the original trust, but the interior—" He made a gesture that suggested catastrophe. "I understand," Preston said. The previous heir, a cousin of yours, I believe, refused the inheritance. Before that, it passed through several hands, none of whom stayed long. Sundberg's expression was neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. The locals have stories about the place. Superstitions, mostly, but deeply held. What kind of stories? Sundberg hesitated. The Ashford family kept to themselves for generations. There were always whispers about strange activities, unusual shipments, odd sounds from the estate. When the last Ashford died in 1962, people were relieved. The castle has sat empty since then, and most prefer it that way. Preston thought about mentioning that he had no other options, that ghost stories weren't particularly frightening when you were homeless. Instead, he just signed the final document. That evening, he sat in the village's only inn, a timber-framed building that had probably stood since before the castle was built. The proprietor, a sturdy woman named Ingrid, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, brought him stew and dark bread without being asked. "You're going up there tomorrow?" she asked in English, only slightly more accented than Sundberg's. "That's the plan." She shook her head. The others never lasted more than a few days. There's something wrong with that place. My grandmother used to say the Ashfords made bargains they shouldn't have, that the castle remembers. Remembers what? Whatever happened in its walls. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. My grandmother worked there as a girl, before the war. She said old Ashford, the last one who actually lived there, would disappear into the lower levels for days. She heard sounds down there, living sounds, she said, but wrong somehow. Preston ate his stew and listened to the wind rattling the inn's windows. He'd spent his career in old buildings. They all had sounds, all had stories. None of them had ever frightened him. "I appreciate the warning," he said. Ingrid straightened, her expression suggesting she'd done her duty, and whatever happened next was on his conscience. "The key is behind the desk. The road up is rough but passable. There's a generator, but I don't know if it still works. Village shops close at 5. That night, Preston lay in a narrow bed under rough wool blankets and thought about the path that had brought him here. Every failure, every loss, every door that had closed. Maybe his ex-wife had been right. Maybe he'd always been better with buildings than people, more comfortable with the past than the present. The castle appeared just after dawn, as his rental car crested the final hill. Preston had seen photographs in the attorney's office, but they hadn't prepared him for the reality. It dominated the landscape like something from a Gothic novel, all severe angles and weathered grey stone, with towers that clawed at the morning sky. Gargoyles perched along the roofline, their features worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. The ground sprawled around it, once formal gardens now wild and overgrown, surrounded by an iron fence with gates that stood permanently open, one hanging askew from a broken hinge. Preston parked in what had once been a courtyard and stepped out into cold mountain air that tasted of pine and stone. Up close, the castle was even more imposing. 3 stories of solid masonry, with narrow windows that looked more defensive than decorative. The architectural style was early Georgian, with some older elements, probably built in stages over decades. His trained eye catalogued the damage, missing roof tiles, cracked foundation stones, sections of wall where the mortar had deteriorated. But the bones were good. The structure was sound. It would take work, but it was salvageable. That thought surprised him. When had he started thinking of this as a project, rather than just a temporary refuge? The main door was oak, iron-bound, and unlocked. It swung open with a shriek of hinges that echoed through empty halls. Preston stepped inside. The entrance hall was vast and dim, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows. A grand staircase curved upward to his left. Directly ahead, He could see through to what looked like a great hall. Portraits lined the walls, stern-faced men and women in period dress, all watching him with painted eyes. Dust covered everything. His footsteps left prints on the stone floor. The air smelled of age and abandonment, but underneath that, something else. Something almost alive, though Preston couldn't quite identify it. He spent that first day exploring, room by room. The castle was larger than he'd realized, dozens of chambers ranging from grand reception rooms to tiny servants' quarters tucked under the eaves. Most of the furniture remained, draped in cloth that disintegrated at his touch. There were signs of habitation from different eras: Victorian wallpaper peeling over Georgian panelling, Art Deco light fixtures installed in Renaissance ceiling mouldings. But it was the study that stopped him cold. He found it on the ground floor, tucked behind what had been a library. The room was perfectly square, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 3 walls and tall windows on the 4th. A massive oak desk dominated the center, its surface cluttered with instruments Preston recognized from his preservation work: calipers, magnifying glasses, drafting tools from the 18th century. But it was the books that caught his attention. Leather-bound volumes, hundreds of them, all meticulously organized. He pulled one down at random, a journal dated 1734, filled with careful handwriting and detailed sketches of birds. Preston opened another, 1745, more sketches, these of small mammals. Another, 1752, plants and insects rendered with scientific precision. His ancestor had been a naturalist then, a scholar who'd devoted his life to documenting the natural world. Preston felt an unexpected kinship with this man he'd never known, this Cornelius Ashford, who'd poured his passion into preservation of a different kind. He was about to leave when something made him pause. As an architect, he'd learned to read spaces, to understand how buildings worked. And something about this room felt wrong. Preston pulled out his measuring tape, a habit from his old life that he'd never quite broken, and measured the study's interior dimensions. Then he went outside and measured the exterior wall. The numbers didn't match. The room was 3 feet shorter inside than it should be. There was a hidden space behind one of the walls. Preston spent the next morning studying the study's walls with the methodical patience his profession had taught him. He ran his hands along the bookcases, tapped the paneling, searched for inconsistencies in the woodwork. The hidden space mocked him with its invisibility. It was nearly noon when he noticed the irregularity. One section of bookshelf, roughly 4 feet wide, sat slightly proud of the wall, perhaps half an inch, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. Preston pressed against it, pulled at it, tried shifting it sideways. Nothing moved. He stepped back, thinking. Cornelius had been a man of science, methodical and precise. Whatever mechanism concealed this space would be elegant, not crude. Preston's eyes traced the carved moulding that framed the bookcase, looking for anything that seemed decorative, but might serve a function. There, a rosette carved into the upper right corner, its petals slightly more worn than the surrounding wood. Preston pressed it. Something clicked deep within the wall. The bookcase swung outward on silent hinges, revealing darkness beyond. Preston's heart hammered as he retrieved his flashlight from the desk. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating stone steps descending into the earth. The air that emerged was cold and stale, but breathable, suggesting ventilation from somewhere below. He should call someone, he thought. The attorney, perhaps, or the village authorities. This was clearly significant, possibly valuable. But even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't. This was his inheritance, his ancestors' secret. Whatever lay below belonged to him alone, at least for now. The steps were worn smooth in their centers, evidence of countless trips up and down over decades, perhaps centuries. Preston counted 43 stairs before reaching level ground. His flashlight revealed a corridor carved from living rock, the walls lined with fitted stone that spoke of serious engineering. This wasn't a wine cellar or root storage. This was something far more ambitious. The corridor ended at a wooden door, surprisingly well preserved in the dry underground air. Preston pushed it open and stepped into a chamber that took his breath away. It was a laboratory, perfectly preserved as if its owner had simply stepped out for tea and never returned. Long wooden benches held brass instruments, microscopes, scales, measurement devices Preston couldn't identify. Glass-fronted cabinets lined one wall, filled with bottles of chemicals whose labels had faded to illegibility. On another wall, detailed anatomical drawings of various species were pinned with surprising care, each labeled in precise script. But it was the journals that drew him forward. Dozens of them, leather-bound and organized by date on specially built shelves. Preston pulled down the earliest one and opened it to the first page. January 3rd, 1723. I have completed the sanctuary's foundation. The work proceeds slowly, for secrecy is paramount. Already I have witnessed the destruction of species through human greed and ignorance. The great auk diminishes yearly. The auroch is gone. How many more will vanish before we realize what we have lost? I cannot stop the tide of extinction alone, but perhaps I can preserve a few precious remnants for a future that may be wiser than our present. Preston read page after page, his flashlight beam moving across Cornelius's careful handwriting. His ancestor had been more than a naturalist. He'd been a visionary who understood what the world was losing long before conservation became a recognized science. The journals detailed his philosophy, his methods, his careful study of species in decline, and his plan to save them. The entries grew more detailed as Preston progressed through the volumes. Cornelius had traveled extensively, collecting breeding pairs of threatened species. He'd built habitats in the underground complex, designed systems for food and water, studied their needs with meticulous attention. He'd recruited others to his cause, a network of naturalists across Europe, who shared his concerns and his secrecy. The local curse that had kept people away from the castle. Cornelius had encouraged it, spread rumors, done everything possible to ensure his work remained undiscovered. In his time, rare species were prizes for collectors, exotic animals killed and stuffed for display in private cabinets of curiosities. Revealing his sanctuary would have been its destruction. Preston set down the journal, his mind reeling. The scope of what his ancestor had attempted was staggering. But had he succeeded? The laboratory was abandoned, the journals ending in 1758 with Cornelius's death. What had happened to his collection? That's when Preston noticed the far wall. Unlike the others, it was solid iron, painted black, with a door set into its center. Heavy bolts secured it, and words had been painted across its surface in Latin. Custodi viventes, guard the living. Something was still down here, something that needed guarding. Preston approached the door slowly, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. He pressed his ear against the cold metal and listened. At first, nothing. Then, a sound. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Movement. A soft rustling, like fabric dragged across stone. And something else, a gentle chirping that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Birds. There were birds behind this door, but that was impossible. Nothing could survive sealed in darkness for decades, let alone centuries. Yet the sound was undeniable, and it wasn't his imagination. Preston had spent enough time in empty buildings to know the difference between ambient noise and actual life. He examined the door more closely. The bolts were heavy but not locked. They could be drawn back easily enough. Beside the door, mounted on the wall, was a glass-covered case containing a brass key on a hook. The glass wasn't sealed. Preston could simply lift it and take the key. His hand hovered over it, trembling slightly. Every instinct told him this was a threshold moment. Whatever lay beyond that door would change everything. The practical part of his mind whispered warnings. Unknown biological hazards, structural instability, liability issues he couldn't begin to calculate. But another part, the part that had spent his career breathing life into dead buildings that had lost everything and come here with nothing left to lose, that part needed to know. Preston lifted the glass cover and took the key. It fit the lock perfectly, turning with surprising ease for something so old. The mechanism clicked. Preston drew back the bolts one by one, their sound echoing in the stone chamber. He placed his hand against the cold iron and pushed. The door swung inward, and a rush of air emerged, stale but not foul, carrying scents of earth and something organic he couldn't quite place. Preston stepped through, raising his flashlight. The beam illuminated a vaulted chamber, far larger than the laboratory, its ceiling lost in shadow above. But what stopped his breath wasn't the space. It was what occupied it. Perches lined the walls, carefully constructed from natural branches. Nesting boxes were built into alcoves. Water troughs ran along the base of one wall, fed by some hidden mechanism that still trickled faintly. And on the perches, in the boxes, moving in the shadows, birds. Preston's flashlight beam caught eyes that reflected green in the darkness. Shapes shifted, wings rustled. A soft, questioning chirp echoed through the chamber. He stepped further inside, his light sweeping across the space. The birds were small, roughly the size of chickens, with distinctive crested heads and long, curved beaks. Their plumage was a mix of dark metallic greens and bronzes, iridescent even in the flashlight's harsh beam. Preston had studied enough architectural history to have encountered natural history as well. He knew what he was looking at, even though his mind rejected it as impossible. European crested ibis, a species declared extinct in the wild in the 1850s. The last captive specimen had died in a Vienna zoo in 1906. Yet here they were, alive. A small colony of them, perhaps 20 birds, moving about their chamber with the casual ease of creatures accustomed to their environment. They watched him with alert curiosity, but not fear, as if some genetic memory told them that humans who entered this space meant no harm. Preston sank to his knees on the stone floor, his flashlight nearly slipping from nerveless fingers. This wasn't possible. Nothing could survive down here, sealed away for over a century. Yet the evidence surrounded him, living and breathing and utterly real. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he noticed more details. The water system was sophisticated, fed by what must be an underground spring. Ventilation shafts, barely visible in the ceiling, brought fresh air from above. And along one wall, massive containers that, when he investigated, proved to contain grain. Ancient, yes, but somehow preserved in the dry underground atmosphere. The birds had been eating the grain stores left by their caretakers, supplemented by insects that found their way into the chamber through the ventilation system. Cornelius hadn't just built a sanctuary. He'd built an ecosystem capable of sustaining itself across generations. Preston looked up at the birds watching him from their perches and felt the weight of an impossible responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Preston spent his first night in the castle unable to sleep, his mind circling endlessly around the impossible discovery in the sanctuary below. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those birds watching him with their ancient, knowing gazes. Species that shouldn't exist, preserved through some miracle of engineering and blind luck, waiting in darkness for someone to find them. By dawn, he'd made a decision. Before doing anything else, he needed to understand what Cornelius had created and how it had survived. He descended the stone steps with the first journal tucked under his arm and a battery-powered lantern in his hand. The birds stirred as he entered their chamber, their movements cautious but not panicked. Preston set the lantern on the floor and began to read. Cornelius's entries from 1723 to 1735 painted a picture of a man driven by purpose that bordered on obsession. He'd witnessed the extinction of the great auk, watched passenger pigeon flocks diminish, seen wolves and bears hunted to extermination across Europe. While his contemporaries collected specimens to stuff and display, Cornelius had a different vision: preservation of living populations. The technical sophistication was remarkable for its time. Cornelius had engineered the water system to draw from an underground spring, creating a self-sustaining supply. The ventilation shafts were positioned to create natural air circulation without exposing the sanctuary's location. He'd even calculated grain storage requirements across generations, stockpiling massive quantities in sealed containers designed to prevent spoilage. But the most touching entries were those describing the birds themselves. Cornelius had acquired 6 breeding pairs of the crested ibis in 1729, trading with a merchant who'd brought them from Eastern Europe before their populations collapsed. He'd documented their behavior, their breeding cycles, their dietary needs. He'd named them Artemis, Apollo, Hera, names that reflected his classical education and his reverence for what he was protecting. Preston looked up from the journal to watch the birds. How many generations had passed since Cornelius's original 6 pairs? 20? 30? The mathematics was staggering. These creatures had been born, lived, bred, and died in this chamber for over 2 centuries, an unbroken chain of survival maintained by systems built by human hands, but operating through natural cycles. The responsibility of it crushed down on him with physical weight. These birds were his now. Their survival depended entirely on his actions, and he had absolutely no idea how to care for them. His architectural training had taught him systems thinking, how components of a building worked together to create a functioning whole. He applied that framework now, studying the sanctuary with professional eyes. The water system was still operating, though some of the brass fittings showed corrosion. The ventilation worked, but could be improved. The grain stores were nearly exhausted. The birds had been surviving on whatever remained, plus insects, and probably some plant matter that found its way down through the ventilation shafts. Preston made lists, his old habits reasserting themselves. Immediate needs: fresh grain supply, water system maintenance, proper lighting to assess the birds' health. Longer-term concerns: genetic diversity, proper nutrition, veterinary care if needed. That last point stopped him. Veterinary care meant bringing someone else into this secret. It meant trusting another person with knowledge that could destroy everything Cornelius had built. He thought about the attorney's warnings, about the villagers' stories. For generations, the Ashford family had maintained absolute secrecy. They'd allowed their reputation to be tarnished, let people believe them cursed or mad, all to protect what lay beneath their castle. Could Preston do any less? But he also knew his limitations. He was an architect, not a biologist. Without expert help, he might inadvertently harm the very things he was trying to protect. The dilemma gnawed at him as he explored further into the sanctuary. Beyond the aviary chamber, another passage led deeper into the complex. Preston followed it, his lantern casting shadows on walls that pressed closer here, the ceiling lower. He passed several sealed doors, each marked with faded labels he couldn't quite read in the dim light. One door stood slightly ajar. Preston pushed it open and raised his lantern. The chamber beyond was empty, but not abandoned. Perches like those in the aviary lined the walls. A dried fountain that had once provided water sat in the corner. And on the wall, detailed sketches showed a large bird of prey, an eagle from the hooked beak and powerful talons, Spanish imperial eagle, according to the caption beneath the drawing. Below that, in Cornelius's precise hand, acquired 1734, breeding pair, high hopes. But the chamber was empty. Whatever eagles had lived here were long gone. Preston found 3 more empty chambers as he explored, each designed for different species. One showed evidence of having housed small mammals. The perches were replaced with tunnels and dens built into the walls. Another seemed designed for reptiles, with flat stones arranged for basking. All empty now, their inhabitants lost to time. Only the ibis had survived. The weight of those failures pressed down on Preston as he returned to the aviary. Cornelius had tried to save so much, and most of it had been lost anyway. The birds watching him now were the sole success in a grand experiment that had mostly ended in extinction. But they were alive. Against all odds, through 2 centuries and circumstances that should have killed them, they had survived. That had to mean something. Preston sat on the stone floor and watched the birds go about their routines. They moved with purpose, grooming, investigating their environment, interacting with each other in ways that suggested complex social structures. One bird, slightly larger than the others with more pronounced crest feathers, seemed to be dominant. It commanded the best perching spot and ate first from the nearly empty grain container. "You need a name," Preston said softly. His voice echoed strangely in the vaulted space, and several birds turned to look at him. "If I'm going to care for you, I should call you something." He thought about Cornelius's classical naming scheme, but rejected it. These weren't the same birds. These were descendants 30 generations removed, shaped by circumstances no ancient Greek god could have imagined. "Perseverance," he said finally. "That's what you represent. Percy for short." The bird, Percy now, tilted its head, as if considering the name, then went back to preening its wing feathers. Preston spent the rest of the day making the sanctuary functional for human habitation as well as avian. He brought down supplies from the castle, LED lanterns to replace his failing flashlight, tools from the workshop he'd discovered on the ground floor, notebooks to continue Cornelius's documentation tradition. He sketched the birds, noting their conditions as best he could with untrained eyes. They seemed healthy, active, alert, feathers glossy in the lantern light, but he had no baseline for comparison, no way to know if what he was seeing represented vigor or decline. As evening approached, Preston climbed back up to the study. His body ached from the physical labor of hauling supplies up and down stone steps. His mind ached from the magnitude of what he'd inherited. But underneath the exhaustion, something else stirred. A feeling he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. His career had been about preservation, about saving beautiful things from destruction. This was preservation of a different order, but the principles were the same. Study the systems, understand what was failing, repair what was broken, maintain what still worked. He could do this. He had to do this. Preston pulled down another of Cornelius's journals, this one from the 1740s, and began to read by lamplight. Outside, night fell over the castle, but in the study, surrounded by his ancestors' careful documentation, Preston felt less alone than he had in years. The birds below slept in their ancient chamber, unaware that their survival had just become the central purpose of a broken man's life. And perhaps that was exactly as it should be. The village of Ravencrest woke early, its rhythms dictated by traditions older than the castle itself. Preston joined that rhythm on his 3rd morning, driving down the winding road to purchase supplies with a carefully prepared list. Grain, he'd decided, would be his first priority. The sanctuary's stores were nearly exhausted, and the birds needed proper nutrition. The general store occupied the ground floor of a half-timbered building that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from centuries of standing. A bell chimed as Preston entered, and the handful of customers inside turned to stare with the frank curiosity of people unused to strangers. "Chicken feed," Preston said to the clerk, a young man with sharp features and sharper eyes. "Whatever you have in bulk." "Planning to farm up there?" the clerk asked, weighing out grain into paper sacks. "Possibly. The grounds could support it." The lie came easily, smoothed by practice. Preston had learned quickly that vagueness served better than invention. He was loading the sacks into his rental car when a voice behind him said, "You're still here, then?" Preston turned to find an older woman watching him with keen interest. She was perhaps 65, with steel-grey hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She wore practical clothes, wool cardigan, sturdy shoes, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I am," Preston said carefully. "Margot Lindgren, village librarian and historical society curator, which means I'm professionally nosy about the castle and everyone connected to it." She offered her hand, and Preston shook it. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Preston Whitmore." "Yes, I know. Gregor mentioned you'd arrived. American architect, last of the Ashford line through your mother's side." She smiled at his expression. "Small village. Word travels. Would you like coffee? The cafe makes decent espresso, and I'd very much like to talk with you." Preston hesitated. Every instinct told him to refuse, to maintain the isolation that had protected the sanctuary for generations. But he also needed information, needed to understand the village's relationship with the castle and his family. And something about Margot suggested she already knew more than she was saying. "Coffee would be good," he said. The cafe was a cozy space with mismatched furniture and walls covered in local artwork. Margot ordered for both of them in rapid Swedish, then led Preston to a corner table away from other patrons. "The Ashford family," she began without preamble, "has fascinated me since I was a child. My grandmother worked at the castle briefly in the 1930s. She had stories." Preston's pulse quickened. "What kind of stories?" "Strange ones. She said the family was secretive, reclusive. They received unusual shipments, large crates delivered at odd hours. There were sounds from below the castle, animal sounds, she thought, though she was never allowed in the lower levels. She was dismissed after 3 months for asking too many questions." Margot sipped her espresso, studying Preston over the rim. "My grandmother was convinced the Ashfords were protecting something." Protecting what? She didn't know, but she always spoke of them with respect, not fear. She said whatever they were doing, it mattered to them deeply. Margot set down her cup. "I've spent years researching the family. Cornelius Ashford was a naturalist, corresponded with scholars across Europe. He published a few papers in the 1730s about species conservation, radical ideas for his time. Then he stopped publishing and retreated to the castle. His daughter continued his work, married locally. Their descendants maintained the estate until 1962. Preston's mind raced. Cornelius's daughter had married locally. That meant, "You're descended from them," he said. Margot's smile widened. "My great-great-great-grandmother was Cornelius's granddaughter, which makes us distant cousins, I suppose. The inheritance passed through the male line, so my branch got stories instead of property. But we kept records, passed down what we knew." She pulled a small notebook from her bag and slid it across the table. "My grandfather was the last to maintain the sanctuary. He died in 1962, suddenly of a heart attack. The knowledge died with him. We've been waiting ever since for someone to return." Preston stared at the notebook, his hand trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside were dates, notes about feeding schedules, water system maintenance, grain deliveries. His grandfather's last entry was dated September 12th, 1962. "Systems stable, population healthy, hope the next guardian proves worthy." "You know," Preston said quietly, "we've always known. My family has guarded the secret for 9 generations." Margot's expression grew serious. "The question is, what will you do with it?" Preston closed the notebook, his mind churning through implications. An ally. He had an ally, someone who understood, who'd been waiting. The relief was almost overwhelming. "I found them," he said. "The birds. They're alive." Margot's eyes glistened. "How many?" 20. Maybe more. They seem healthy, but I don't really know. I'm not qualified for this. My grandfather was a veterinarian. He left notes, instructions. I have them at home." She reached across the table and gripped his hand. "You're not alone in this, Preston. That's what I came to tell you. The secret has been kept by many hands over many years. It's too important for one person to carry alone." They talked for 2 hours, Margot sharing what her family had preserved, and Preston describing what he'd found. She knew about the empty chambers, the species that hadn't survived. Her grandfather had documented their failures as carefully as their success. "The ibis survived because they're adaptable," Margot explained. "They can eat various foods, breed readily in captivity, tolerate the enclosed environment. The others, the eagles, the wolves, the bears Cornelius tried to save, they needed more than he could provide." "There are other sealed chambers," Preston said. "I haven't opened them yet." Margot's expression shifted to something like hope, mixed with fear. "My grandfather sealed 3 chambers before he died. He said they contained Cornelius's most important work, but they weren't to be opened until a true Ashford returned to claim the inheritance. He believed the timing mattered." "Why?" "Because the world wasn't ready. The knowledge had to be protected until people valued preservation over exploitation." She pulled out a key on a silver chain around her neck. "He gave this to my grandmother. Said it would open the final door when the time came." Preston looked at the key, then at Margot. "You think the time has come? I think you're here. I think the birds have survived. I think that means something." She tucked the key away. "But we need to be careful. There are people who would see this as an opportunity for profit rather than preservation. Private collectors who'd pay fortunes for extinct species. Governments that might seize the sanctuary for research. We must protect what Cornelius built. How do we do that? Slowly, carefully. We learn to care for them properly first. Then we decide if and when the world should know." Margot stood, gathering her things. "Tomorrow I'll bring my grandfather's journals. We'll work through them together. For now, get those birds fed properly. They've been waiting long enough." Preston walked back to his car in a daze. The isolation he'd expected had transformed into partnership. The impossible burden had become shared responsibility, and for the first time since finding the sanctuary, he felt something like hope. That night, as he descended into the chamber with fresh grain and Margot's grandfather's feeding instructions, the birds greeted him with familiar chirps. Percy watched from his perch as Preston filled the containers, and Preston could have sworn the bird's expression held approval. Margot arrived the following morning with a leather satchel full of journals and a determination that matched Preston's own. Together they descended into the sanctuary, and Preston watched her face transform as she entered the aviary for the first time in decades. "I was 12 when my grandfather brought me here," she said softly, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "He wanted me to understand what our family protected. I never thought I'd see them again." The birds seemed to sense her emotion, gathering closer with curious chirps. Percy tilted his head, studying this new human with interest. Over the following weeks, they established routines. Margot brought her grandfather's detailed care instructions, and together they implemented proper feeding schedules, cleaned the water systems, and monitored the birds' health. Preston's architectural skills proved valuable in repairing the aging infrastructure, replacing corroded pipes, reinforcing support structures, improving ventilation without compromising secrecy. "Your ancestor was brilliant," Preston said one afternoon as they reviewed Cornelius's original designs. "This system was built to last centuries. The mathematics alone, calculating population sustainability, resource requirements, environmental balance, it's remarkable for any era, let alone the 1720s. "Cornelius understood something most people still don't grasp," Margot replied, running her finger along a sketch of the water circulation system. That preservation requires thinking in generations, not years. He built this for a future he'd never see. Preston thought about his own life. His career focused on immediate projects with definable endpoints. The idea of working towards something that wouldn't be completed in his lifetime felt both foreign and deeply appealing. One evening, as they sat in the study reviewing breeding records, Margot pulled out a pressed flower from between journal pages. It was perfectly preserved, its delicate petals still holding faint color. 1889, she read from the notation beneath it. My great-grandmother pressed this. The note says, "The last guardian keeps watch." She was reminding herself that she wasn't the end of the line, just one link in a chain. Preston held the fragile flower carefully. Did she know about your grandfather? That he'd continue the work? She made sure of it. Trained him from childhood, just as her father trained her. Margot's expression grew thoughtful. That's what's been missing since 1962, the continuity. Knowledge passed down through teaching, not just written records. You're teaching me now. Yes, but I'm 73, Preston. I won't be here forever. You need to think about succession, about who comes after you. The thought unsettled him. He'd only just begun to understand his role as guardian. The idea of training someone else, of ensuring the sanctuary survived beyond his own lifetime, felt overwhelming. One crisis at a time, he said, attempting levity. But Margot's serious expression told him she'd planted a seed that would need addressing eventually. Their work developed a comfortable rhythm until the morning Margot arrived, with worry lines creasing her forehead. There's someone asking questions in the village, she said, without preamble. A man, 40s, American accent. He's been researching the Ashford family history at the library, asking about unusual animal shipments in the historical records. Preston's stomach dropped. What kind of questions? Specific ones. He knows about Cornelius's naturalist work, his correspondence with other scholars. He's tracking something, Preston, and he's getting close. They found the man that afternoon at the village's only restaurant, studying documents spread across his table. He was perhaps 45, with sun-weathered skin and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Expensive camera equipment sat in the chair beside him. Quentin Aldridge, he introduced himself when Preston approached. Wildlife photographer and conservation researcher. And you must be the new Ashford heir everyone's talking about. Preston Whitmore. He shook Aldridge's hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. What brings you to Ravencrest? A mystery I've been chasing for years. Aldridge gestured to his documents, copies of historical shipping records, correspondence, customs manifests. In the 1720s through 1890s, unusual quantities of exotic animals were shipped to this region. Most went to private collectors or menageries, but some shipments came here, to Ravencrest, addressed to Cornelius Ashford and his descendants. My ancestor was a naturalist, Preston said carefully. He studied animals. He did more than study them. Aldridge pulled out a letter, its text faded but readable. This is correspondence between Cornelius and a French scholar discussing the need to preserve breeding populations of threatened species. It's dated 1732. Preston, that's nearly a century before the concept of conservation biology existed formally. Your ancestor was a pioneer. Preston felt Margot's presence behind him, her tension palpable. I've spent my career documenting endangered species, Aldridge continued. Watching populations decline, habitats destroyed. I've stood in places where species went extinct, knowing we could have prevented it. When I found references to Cornelius's work, to his theory about preserving living populations rather than just specimens, I had to investigate. If he actually attempted it, if any records survived, why? Preston interrupted. Why does it matter now? Aldridge's expression shifted to something raw and honest. Because I need to believe it's possible, that someone, somewhere, actually succeeded in saving something before it was too late. The world is in crisis, Preston. Species are vanishing at rates not seen since the dinosaurs. I need hope that preservation is possible, that people have been fighting this fight longer than we think. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but Preston had learned caution. I appreciate your interest, but there's nothing at the castle beyond old journals and empty rooms. My ancestor's work died with him. I don't believe that. Aldridge's tone wasn't confrontational, just matter-of-fact. The Ashford family maintained this property for over 2 centuries, kept it isolated, protected. That's not the behavior of people preserving empty rooms. They were guarding something. Stories and superstition, Preston said. The locals have wild theories. Do they? Aldridge leaned forward. Or do they have generational memory of truth? I've worked in enough remote areas to know that local legends often have roots in reality. Margot spoke for the first time. Mr. Aldridge, you seem like a sincere man. But you're pursuing something that may not exist anymore. Time destroys everything, eventually. Not everything. Aldridge's gaze moved between them, and Preston saw the exact moment the researcher realized they knew more than they were saying. You've found something. I can see it in how carefully you're choosing your words. Preston stood. Thank you for your interest in my family history. I wish you well with your research. I'm staying at the inn, Aldridge said, as Preston turned to leave. Room 7. If you ever want to talk about conservation philosophy, or if you find anything in those journals that might interest a researcher, I'd welcome the conversation. Outside, Preston and Margot walked in tense silence until they reached her cottage. He knows, Margot said flatly. He suspects. That's different from knowing. For now. But he's intelligent and persistent. Men like that don't give up easily. She turned to face him. We need to decide, Preston. Do we trust him, or do we drive him away? Preston thought about Aldridge's expression when he'd spoken about needing hope, about his career documenting extinction. Then he thought about the birds below the castle, about 2 centuries of secrecy, maintained at great cost. I don't know, he admitted. I honestly don't know. Aldridge didn't leave. Over the next 2 weeks, Preston spotted him throughout the village, photographing the landscape, interviewing elderly residents, always with that same focused intensity. He never approached the castle directly, but his presence was a constant weight on Preston's shoulders. He's being careful, Margot observed during one of their morning sanctuary visits. He knows he's made us nervous, so he's backing off, letting us come to him. Or he's gathering evidence to force our hand, Preston replied, watching Percy lead the morning feeding ritual with his usual authority. The birds had grown noticeably healthier under proper care, their feathers more lustrous, their movements more energetic. I've been researching him, Margot said, pulling out her tablet. Quentin Aldridge has published extensively in conservation journals, 30 papers on endangered species preservation, multiple books. He's respected in his field. She scrolled through articles, showing Preston photographs of Aldridge in various locations, documenting snow leopards in the Himalayas, tracking rare birds in Southeast Asia, studying marine life in threatened coral reefs. But look at this. She pulled up a recent bankruptcy filing. He's financially ruined. Divorce settlement, child support for 2 teenagers, medical bills from a climbing accident 3 years ago. He's underwater by nearly $200,000. Preston's stomach tightened. So he's desperate. Or he's someone who's sacrificed everything for work he believes in. Margot's tone was neutral, but her eyes were troubled. The question is whether desperation would make him betray principles he's held his entire career. That night, Preston couldn't sleep. He stood at the study window, staring out at darkness, broken only by distant village lights. The sanctuary below felt like a ticking bomb. Every day it remained, secret was another day closer to discovery. But revelation could mean destruction, just as surely as continued hiding. His thoughts drifted to his ex-wife's final words before she'd left. "You're better at loving buildings than people because buildings don't require trust." At the time, he'd been hurt. Now he wondered if she'd been right. Trust was a risk he'd spent his life avoiding, preferring the certainty of brick and mortar over the unpredictability of human relationships. But the sanctuary couldn't survive on his efforts alone. He'd learned that much from Margot's grandfather's journals. The work required community, required passing knowledge forward. Isolation had protected the secret, but it had also nearly killed it. If Margot's grandfather hadn't died suddenly, if he'd had time to train a successor properly, the sanctuary wouldn't have sat abandoned for decades. The next morning, Preston found a note slipped under the castle's main door. Aldridge's handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its clarity. "Preston, I understand your caution. If our situations were reversed, I'd feel the same. But I want you to know something about me that might matter. Last year, I was offered $500,000 by a private collector to reveal the location of a snow leopard den I'd discovered in Nepal. The collector wanted cubs for his personal menagerie. I refused, even though that money would have solved every financial problem I have. I've spent my career documenting beauty, so others might value it enough to protect it. I would never betray that principle for profit. If you ever decide to trust me, I'll prove this to you. Until then, I respect your need for privacy. QA." Preston read the note 3 times, then took it to Margot. "It's exactly what I'd write if I wanted to earn someone's trust," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean it's not also true." "We need help," Preston said. "The birds laid eggs last week, 4 nests. If they hatch successfully, the population will grow. I don't know enough about genetics, about managing breeding programs. We're playing at being experts when we're just educated amateurs." My grandfather's notes are 60 years old. Conservation science has advanced. We're working with information from a veterinarian who never had formal training in exotic species. Preston ran his hands through his hair. "I'm terrified of making mistakes that harm them. They've survived 2 centuries. What if our ignorance kills them?" Margot was quiet for a long moment. "What do you propose?" "A test. We show him the aviary, nothing more. We watch how he reacts, what his first instincts are. Does he reach for his camera or his notebook? Does he ask about publication or about their health? We give him enough truth to reveal his character. And if he runs straight to the media, then we were always going to be discovered eventually. At least this way we choose the moment." They spent 2 days preparing. Preston reviewed every security measure, ensured the other sealed chambers were truly inaccessible, prepared cover stories for anything Aldridge might ask. Margot researched conservation law, understanding what protections might exist if the discovery became public. On the 3rd day, Preston called Aldridge's inn room. "I'd like to show you something," he said, without preamble. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Come alone. Bring no camera equipment. Tell no one where you're going. If you break any of those conditions, you'll never see it." Aldridge's pause lasted only a heartbeat. "I understand. Thank you, Preston." That night, Preston barely slept. He descended to the sanctuary at dawn, finding Margot already there. Together they cleaned, organized, made everything as presentable as possible. The birds sensed their agitation, moving restlessly on their perches. "Last chance to change your mind," Margot said, as 8 o'clock approached. Preston thought about Cornelius, about 9 generations of guardians who'd carried this burden in isolation, about his ex-wife's accusation that he couldn't trust people, about the eggs waiting to hatch, and the knowledge he didn't possess to help them survive. "No," he said. "It's time." The knock came precisely at 8. Preston opened the castle door to find Aldridge standing empty-handed, wearing simple field clothes. His expression was carefully neutral, but Preston saw the tension in his shoulders, the anticipation he was trying to conceal. "Thank you for coming," Preston said. "Before we go further, I need your word. What you see today stays between us until we decide otherwise. No photographs, no notes, no publications, no colleagues, no exceptions. Your word, Quentin, or we stop here." Aldridge met his eyes. "You have it. Whatever you show me remains confidential until you release me from that promise." Preston studied him for another long moment, weighing 2 centuries of secrecy against his instinct that this man could be trusted. Then he stepped aside. "Follow me." He led Aldridge through the castle to the study, watching the researcher's eyes track the journals on the shelves, the instruments on the desk. When Preston opened the concealed door, Aldridge's sharp intake of breath was audible. They descended in silence, Preston's lantern lighting the stone steps. At the bottom, the laboratory stretched before them, brass instruments gleaming in the lamplight. "Cornelius built this," Preston said quietly. 1793. A sanctuary for species he believed would vanish. Aldridge moved forward slowly, reverence in every step. He examined the equipment without touching, read the journal spines without pulling them down, absorbed everything with the intensity of someone witnessing something sacred. Then Preston opened the aviary door. Aldridge stood frozen in the aviary doorway. His face drained of color, and for a moment Preston thought the man might faint. Then Aldridge's knees buckled, and he sank to the stone floor, staring at the birds with an expression of absolute wonder. "European crested ibis," he whispered. "That's impossible. They're extinct. The last one died in 1906. "Apparently not," Preston said quietly. Aldridge's hands trembled as he raised them, not reaching for the birds, but simply held out in a gesture of amazement. Tears tracked down his weathered face. "How many?" 23 adults, 4 nests with eggs." "My God," Aldridge's voice broke. "They've been here since Cornelius? 9 generations of guardians maintained them. The last died in 1962. They've been surviving on their own since then." Margot stepped forward from the shadows where she'd been watching. "The question, Mr. Aldridge, is what do we do now? What would you do?" Aldridge stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the birds. Percy watched him from the dominant perch, head tilted with characteristic curiosity. The researcher's first movement wasn't toward his pockets for a phone or notebook. He moved deeper into the chamber, examining the water system, the feeding stations, the nesting boxes with a professional's trained eye. "Their plumage is good," he murmured, more to himself than to Preston and Margot. "Body condition appears healthy. The nesting behavior is positive, but genetic diversity. How many breeding pairs originally?" 6, Preston said. "In 1729. Aldridge nodded slowly. 296 years of breeding from 6 pairs. The genetic bottleneck would be severe, but if they've survived this long, they've managed it somehow. Possibly some natural selection favored hardier genetics." He turned to face them. "They need modern veterinary assessment, genetic testing, careful monitoring, and they need to not be alone anymore." "What do you mean?" Margot asked sharply. "This is miraculous. A species thought extinct for over a century, preserved by incredible human dedication and engineering genius. But they're still at risk every day they remain here. One disease, one system failure, one mistake." He stopped, collecting himself. "They need redundancy, backup populations in other secure locations, genetic records, breeding programs managed by multiple experts. They need the infrastructure of modern conservation." Preston felt his chest tighten. "You want to take them away?" "No." Aldridge's voice was firm. I want to ensure they survive for another 3 centuries. This sanctuary is remarkable, but it's also fragile. What happens if you die suddenly like Margot's grandfather? What if there's an earthquake, a fire, a contamination of the water supply? The same risks existed for Cornelius, Margot said, and he lost most of his species, Aldridge replied gently. The ibis survived partly through good planning and partly through luck. We can't rely on luck anymore. Preston walked to Percy's perch, and the bird leaned down to examine him with familiar confidence. Over the past weeks, he'd developed bonds with these creatures. They weren't just rare birds. They were individuals, descendants of survivors, living testaments to his ancestors' vision. What you're describing means revealing them, Preston said. Once that happens, we lose control. Governments get involved, universities, conservation organizations. This stops being a sanctuary and becomes a research facility. Not necessarily. Aldridge moved closer, his voice earnest. I know people, trusted colleagues who've spent their lives protecting endangered species. We could build a network quietly, establish breeding populations in secure locations before any public announcement, create legal protections, establish sanctuary ownership trusts. Do this carefully, correctly, so that when the world learns about them, they're already protected. How long would that take? Margot asked. Years. Maybe 5 to establish everything properly. But it would mean the ibis survive not just our lifetimes, but potentially forever. Preston looked at Margot, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. Everything Aldridge said made logical sense, but 2 centuries of secrecy screamed warnings against trust. There's more, Preston said abruptly, making a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Other chambers, sealed since the 1800s and 1900s. We don't know what survived in them. Aldridge's eyes widened. You haven't opened them. We were waiting, Margot said, for the right moment, the right person. She pulled out the silver key from around her neck. My grandfather sealed 3 chambers before he died. He said they contained Cornelius's most important work. They left the aviary and walked deeper into the sanctuary. Preston led them past the empty chambers he'd already explored to an area where 3 steel doors stood unmarked except for small plaques with dates, 1887, 1934, and a third marked only 1758, primum mobile. The first mover, Aldridge translated, Aristotle's term for the initial cause of all motion. Why would Cornelius mark a chamber with that? We're about to find out, Preston said. They opened the 1887 chamber first. Inside, they found a carefully preserved habitat designed for larger animals, with running water and artificial dens built into the walls. And in those dens, curled together for warmth, a family of Iberian lynx blinked at the sudden light. Aldridge gasped. Lynx pardonus, critically endangered, maybe 300 left in the wild. He moved forward slowly, reverently. There are 4 adults, 3 juveniles. They're magnificent. The lynx watched them with wary golden eyes, their tufted ears and spotted coats marking them as one of Europe's rarest predators. They were lean but healthy, their habitat showing evidence of the same self-sustaining systems that had kept the ibis alive. How? Aldridge breathed. How did they survive? Cornelius's engineering, Preston said, and probably adaptability. Small prey animals must find their way down through ventilation shafts. The system becomes its own ecosystem. They opened the 1934 chamber next. Inside, elderly Spanish imperial eagles perched on carefully constructed platforms. 2 birds, their plumage dulled with age, but their eyes still sharp and intelligent. They're old, Aldridge said softly, examining them from a respectful distance. 30, maybe 35 years, near the end of their natural lifespan. But they made it. Against all odds, they made it. Preston felt emotion tighten his throat. These birds had lived their entire lives in darkness, never seeing open sky, never feeling wind under their wings. Yet they'd survived, carrying forward their species through sheer existence. "The final chamber," Margot said, holding up her key. "Whatever's in there, Cornelius considered it his greatest achievement." The key fit smoothly, and the door opened with a sigh of equalized pressure. Preston raised his lantern, and all three stepped inside. It wasn't a habitat. It was an archive. The chamber was small, carefully climate-controlled, lined with metal cabinets and glass-fronted storage units. Inside those units, thousands of sealed containers holding seeds, each labeled with species names and collection dates. Below those, preservation units containing what looked like tissue samples in specialized solutions. "This isn't just a sanctuary," Aldridge said, his voice shaking. "This is a genetic library. Cornelius was preserving biological material from species he couldn't save alive." Preston opened the nearest cabinet, finding careful documentation. Species names, many he recognized as long extinct. Collection methods, preservation techniques, detailed notes in multiple hands, showing generation after generation, adding to the collection. "Some of these samples are from the 1700s, Margot said, examining labels. "If the preservation worked, modern science might be able to resurrect them," Aldridge finished. "Extract viable DNA, potentially clone or reconstruct populations. This is—" He stopped, overwhelmed. "This is priceless. In the wrong hands, it would be exploited for profit. In the right hands, it could restore entire ecosystems." Preston looked at the archive surrounding them, understanding now the full scope of what Cornelius had built. Not just a sanctuary for living species, but a seed bank for the future. A genetic library waiting for a time when humanity might finally be ready to undo some of the damage it had caused. "Now do you understand?" Preston asked Aldridge quietly. "Why we had to be careful? Why trust is so difficult?" Aldridge nodded slowly. "And now you understand why I said they can't remain here alone. This is too important to risk. We need to protect it properly." The discovery of the genetic archive changed everything. For 3 days, Preston, Margot, and Aldridge worked to document its contents, moving carefully through Cornelius's meticulous cataloging system. Each container held not just biological material, but hope, the possibility that species lost to time might someday return. But on the 4th morning, Margot arrived at the castle with tension written across her features. "Aldridge has been making calls," she said without preamble. "I heard him at the inn yesterday evening, speaking quietly in the courtyard. He mentioned preservation protocols and secure facilities." Preston's stomach dropped. He promised confidentiality. And perhaps he's keeping it, speaking only to people he trusts. But once information leaves this castle, we lose control of it. Margot set down her bag heavily. "We need to make a decision. Either we commit to working with him fully, or we stop now before this goes further." They found Aldridge in the sanctuary, sitting on the stone floor of the aviary, making detailed observations in a weathered field journal. He looked up as they approached, and something in their expressions made him close the notebook slowly. "You've been making calls," Preston said. Aldridge didn't deny it. "I have. To 3 people I've worked with for over 20 years. People I trust with my life." He stood, meeting Preston's gaze directly. "I reached out to Ingrid Kasper, a geneticist in Munich who specializes in population recovery, to Yuki Tanaka, who runs a private sanctuary in Japan for endangered birds, and to Simon Okonkwo, an expert in establishing conservation trusts." "You had no right," Margot said sharply. "I had every right if we're going to save these animals properly." Aldridge's voice remained calm but firm. "Preston, Margot, I understand your instinct to protect secrecy. But I've spent my career watching species vanish because people waited too long to act. The ibis have survived through luck as much as design. The lynx population is dangerously small. Those eagles are dying. We don't have the luxury of time. What did you tell them? Preston demanded. Nothing specific. I said I'd found evidence of a significant conservation discovery and needed their expertise in confidence. All three agreed to sign non-disclosure agreements before learning more. He pulled out his phone. I can call them back right now and tell them I was mistaken. But we'll be alone again, making critical decisions with incomplete knowledge. Preston wanted to be angry, but he recognized the truth in Aldridge's words. The past weeks had shown him how little he understood about proper animal care, genetic management, long-term sustainability. His architectural skills had helped maintain the physical infrastructure, but the living creatures needed expertise he simply didn't possess. I want to meet them, Preston said finally, before they learn anything specific, before any commitments are made. I want to look them in the eye and decide if they're worthy of this trust. Aldridge nodded slowly. Fair enough. But there's something else we need to discuss first. He led them back to Cornelius's final chamber, the genetic archive, and pointed to a sealed envelope attached to the inner door. In aged script, it read, "To the guardian who opens the last chamber." I noticed this yesterday, Aldridge said. You mentioned Cornelius left instructions. Have you read them? Preston carefully removed the envelope, its wax seal still intact after 2.5 centuries. Inside, several pages of thick paper covered in Cornelius's precise handwriting. He read aloud, "To the guardian who stands where I once stood, who carries the burden I have borne. You have discovered what I could not share in my lifetime. 9 species I attempted to save, and by the time of my writing, 5 have failed despite my best efforts. The great auk is gone. The aurochs are gone. The others cling to existence by threads I pray you have the skill to strengthen. I write this at age 73, knowing my time grows short. My daughter will continue this work, and her children after her, but I fear the weight of secrecy may become too great. Future guardian, you face a choice I could not make, whether to reveal what we have protected or to maintain the isolation that has kept it safe. I have spent my life watching greed destroy beauty, private collectors who buy rare creatures for vanity, hunters who kill the last of a species for sport, merchants who trade in extinction. In my era, revelation would have meant destruction. But I built this archive, this genetic library, in hope that your era might be different, that humanity might have learned to value preservation over possession. The question you must answer, is your time that time? Preston's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. I do not envy you this decision. If you reveal too soon, greedy men will exploit what we have protected. If you wait too long, time itself becomes the enemy. Some wisdom I can offer. First, trust must be earned slowly and tested thoroughly. Do not share the entirety of our work with any soul until you are certain of their integrity. Second, build alliances carefully. One person cannot sustain this burden forever, but too many voices create chaos and compromise. Third, remember that our purpose is not preservation for its own sake, but restoration. These species should not live forever in darkness. They should return to the world if that world can be made safe for them. Finally, know that you do not bear this burden alone. Every guardian before you has struggled with these same questions. We are united across time in purpose, if not presence. May you find the wisdom I couldn't, the courage I lacked, and the allies I never trusted myself to seek. The future of what we have protected rests now in your hands. The letter was signed simply, Cornelius Ashford, Guardian, 1758. Silence filled the chamber when Preston finished reading. The weight of Cornelius's words pressed down on all three of them. A question echoing across 2.5 centuries, demanding an answer. "Is your time that time?" Margot repeated softly. "I've asked myself that question my entire life. My grandfather believed the answer was no. He chose continued isolation over revelation. And the sanctuary nearly died because of it," Aldridge said gently. "When he passed suddenly, decades of knowledge disappeared. If Preston hadn't inherited the castle, everything here would have eventually failed. Isolation protected them, but it also made them vulnerable." Preston walked through the genetic archive, looking at centuries of careful preservation, thousands of samples representing hundreds of species, some still alive in the world, others extinct everywhere, except in these sealed containers. The scope of what Cornelius and his successors had accomplished was staggering. "I spent my career trying to save beautiful old buildings," he said quietly. "I believed that preservation mattered, that keeping pieces of the past alive enriched the present. But buildings don't breed, don't evolve, don't require food and care and genetic diversity. They just stand or fall based on structural integrity." He turned to face Margot and Aldridge. "These creatures aren't artifacts to be locked away in storage. They're living beings that deserve more than survival in darkness. Cornelius was right. Our purpose should be restoration, not just preservation." "So you've made your decision," Margot said. "I've made part of it. We move forward carefully, test trust thoroughly, build alliances slowly, exactly as Cornelius advised." Preston looked at Aldridge. "Bring your colleagues here. Let me meet them. But understand this. They come one at a time. They sign legal documents protecting the sanctuary, and at the first sign that profit matters more than preservation, we shut this down completely." Aldridge extended his hand. "Agreed. I'll contact them today and arrange visits over the next 2 weeks." As they shook hands, Preston felt the weight of decision settle over him. For better or worse, the sanctuary's centuries of isolation were ending. What came next would determine whether Cornelius's life work survived or became just another cautionary tale about trust misplaced. Ingrid Casper arrived first, a woman in her early 60s with steel-grey hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions about species survival. Preston met her at the castle gate, studying her as carefully as she studied him. She wore practical field clothes and carried only a small backpack, no camera equipment, no recording devices, just notebooks, and what looked like basic medical supplies. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her German accent precise. "Quentin speaks highly of you. He says you're a man who understands the weight of responsibility." "He might be optimistic," Preston replied. "I'm an architect who inherited something far beyond my expertise. The best guardians are often reluctant ones. They understand what they're risking." She glanced up at the castle. "Shall we proceed?" Quentin said, "I would need to sign documents first." Margot had prepared comprehensive non-disclosure agreements with help from a trusted attorney who believed he was drafting papers for rare book preservation. Ingrid read every word carefully before signing. "I have spent my career trying to undo genetic bottlenecks," she said as she set down the pen, "bringing species back from the edge of extinction by carefully managing breeding programs. Most of the time I arrive too late, the population too small, the genetic diversity too compromised. Whatever you have here, I will protect it with my life." Something in her tone convinced Preston more than any legal document could. He led her through the castle to the study, watching her reaction as the concealed door opened. She descended the stone steps with reverence, one hand trailing along the ancient walls. The laboratory stopped her cold. She moved among the instruments, examining everything with professional, Fascination. This is extraordinary. The sophistication of design, the understanding of environmental control. Whoever built this was a genius. My ancestor, Cornelius Ashford, 1723. Impossible, but her tone suggested she was reconsidering what she thought possible. Preston opened the aviary door. Ingrid's sharp intake of breath was the only sound. She stood motionless, watching the ibis move about their chamber with practiced ease. Percy, from his dominant perch, studied this new human with characteristic curiosity. "European crested ibis," she whispered. "Extinct since 1906, except they're not extinct at all." She didn't move closer immediately. Instead, she knelt on the stone floor, watching their behavior with trained observation. Preston saw her noting social hierarchies, breeding condition, health indicators, all the subtle signs an expert would recognize. "How many generations?" she asked, without looking away from the birds. "We estimate somewhere between 30 and 40 from 6 original breeding pairs. The genetic bottleneck should have killed them. Inbreeding depression, accumulation of deleterious mutations." She stopped, shaking her head. "Yet here they are, clearly healthy. The population must have been managed carefully, or natural selection was remarkably efficient at removing harmful genes." "Can you help them?" Preston asked. "Help them?" Ingrid finally looked at him, and he saw tears tracking down her weathered face. "Mr. Whitmore, this is the most important genetic population I've ever encountered. These birds represent an unbroken lineage stretching back 3 centuries. Their DNA is a living record of adaptation and survival. Yes, I can help them. I can develop breeding strategies to maximize genetic diversity going forward, establish genetic baselines, create backup populations. But more than that, I can ensure they survive another 300 years. She stood slowly, wiping her eyes unselfconsciously. "Show me everything. I need to understand the full scope of what we're protecting." They showed her the links, and Preston watched her professional composure crack again. She examined the family from a respectful distance, making detailed notes about their condition, their habitat, their behavior. 7 individuals from what was probably 2 breeding pairs. The genetic diversity is limited, but manageable if we're careful. She looked at Preston. "These links need connection to wild populations eventually. We'll need to establish very careful breeding programs, possibly outcross with Iberian lynx in Spain under extremely controlled conditions." The eagles brought quiet sadness to her expression. "They're old. Beautiful, but old. They've lived far beyond normal lifespans, which tells me the environmental conditions here are remarkably stable. But they're nearing the end." "Can we save them?" Margot asked. "Their genetics, yes, if we can harvest viable samples before they pass. The species itself still exists in small numbers in Spain. But these individuals," she shook her head gently, "we celebrate their long lives and prepare for their natural deaths. That's all we can do." Finally, they showed her the genetic archive. Ingrid moved through it like someone in a cathedral, touching nothing but absorbing everything. When she read the labels, species names spanning centuries, some still existing, many long vanished, her composure finally broke completely. She sat down heavily on the stone floor and wept. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment, wiping her face. "It's just, do you understand what this represents? Genetic material from species we thought lost forever. With modern techniques, with time and resources and careful work, we might be able to bring some of them back. Not all, perhaps not even most, but some." "At what cost?" Preston asked quietly. Ingrid looked up at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "Cornelius wrote that we should only reveal this when the world is ready to value preservation over possession. Is it? Or will this become a circus, with governments and corporations fighting over who controls extinct species' DNA. Both, Ingrid said honestly. The scientific community would celebrate this discovery. But you're right, there would be fighting over control, over access, over commercial applications. That's why we must establish legal protections first, create trusts, establish sanctuary status, build frameworks that prevent exploitation before any public announcement. How long would that take? Years. 5 at minimum, possibly longer. She stood, her composure restored. But I can begin work immediately on the living populations, genetic testing, health assessments, breeding strategies. That work can proceed quietly while we build legal protections. Preston exchanged glances with Margot, seeing his own cautious hope reflected in her expression. There are 2 more colleagues coming, he said, a sanctuary operator and a legal expert in conservation trusts. If they prove as trustworthy as you seem to be, we'll move forward. Ingrid pulled out her notebook, already sketching breeding program frameworks. When can I begin the genetic testing? I'll need blood samples from all the birds and lynx, detailed health assessments. Soon, Preston said, but first, we make sure our foundation is solid. Cornelius built this sanctuary to last centuries. We won't compromise that legacy by rushing. Ingrid nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was saying. Then I'll wait. But know this, Mr. Whitmore. You're not alone anymore. Whatever happens next, you have allies who understand what you're protecting. Yuki Tanaka arrived 3 days later, during a spring rain that turned the castle grounds misty and dreamlike. She was younger than Preston expected, perhaps 40, with intelligent dark eyes and an economy of movement that suggested careful observation of the world around her. I run a private sanctuary in Nagano, she explained, as they sat in the study, rain drumming against the windows. 40 hectares dedicated to endangered Japanese species. I've spent 15 years building habitats that allow natural behavior while providing protection from human encroachment. Why keep it private? Margot asked. Because public sanctuaries become tourist attractions. Well-meaning visitors create stress, introduce diseases, disrupt breeding cycles. The species I protect need peace, not publicity. She set down her tea. Quentin said you have something that requires absolute discretion. That's why I came. Preston led her down after she signed the agreements. Her reaction to the sanctuary was different from Ingrid's, quieter, more contemplative. She studied the aviary for a long time before speaking. They've adapted to captivity across generations, she observed. Their behavior patterns show no memory of wild existence. These birds have never known open sky. Is that wrong? Preston asked, hearing judgment in her tone. Not wrong. Tragic. But necessary, given the circumstances. She moved closer, and Percy watched her with interest. The question becomes, what is their future? Do they remain here forever, or do we work toward eventual release? Release into what? Margot said. Their natural habitats are gone or compromised. Then we create new ones, or restore old ones. Yuki's expression held quiet determination. I've spent my career understanding that true conservation isn't about keeping animals in cages, even beautiful ones. It's about creating conditions where they can exist wild and free again. She examined the lynx with similar thoughtfulness. These are large predators. They need territory, need to hunt, need freedom to express natural behaviors. This chamber, remarkable as it is still a cage. A cage that kept them alive, Preston said, feeling defensive. Yes, and I honor that completely. Your ancestor performed a miracle. Yuki turned to face him. But miracles have purposes. These animals survived so that someday, somewhere, they might live as their genetics intend. My role, if you'll have me, is to help plan for that future. To identify where they might eventually be released, to work with conservation organizations to prepare habitats, to ensure that when the time comes, they have wild spaces waiting. Preston found himself challenged by her vision. He'd thought of himself as a guardian, a keeper, someone who maintained what Cornelius had built. Yuki was describing something more ambitious, actual restoration, return to wildness. That could take decades, he said, almost certainly, but every journey begins with planning. She pulled out her own notebook, already sketching habitat requirements. The ibis need wetlands, specific vegetation, protection from predators. The lynx need forests with adequate prey populations, minimal human contact. These conditions exist or can be created, but it requires coordination across nations, agreements with governments, funding for habitat restoration. You're describing an impossible task, Margot said. I'm describing necessary work. Impossible simply means no one's done it yet. Yuki's smile was gentle but firm. I've helped restore populations of the Japanese crested ibis, a close relative of yours. 20 years ago, there were fewer than a dozen left. Now there are hundreds in protected wild habitats. It can be done. Simon Okonkwo arrived 2 days later, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with greying hair and the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex legal and political landscapes. He'd established conservation trusts across Africa, protecting endangered species through innovative legal frameworks. Quentin tells me you have something worth protecting, he said, in accented English that carried traces of Lagos and London. Something requiring very careful legal structure. After the now familiar ritual of agreements and dissent, Simon examined the sanctuary with a lawyer's practical eye. He asked about ownership documentation, local laws, international treaties, inheritance structures. His questions were less about the animals themselves than about the legal framework sustaining them. Remarkable, he said finally, but legally vulnerable. This property could be seized under eminent domain for scientific research, claimed by environmental agencies, contested by distant relatives. We need to establish protections immediately. In the study, he outlined his proposal. We create a conservation trust with perpetual charter. The sanctuary becomes legally distinct from personal property, governed by a board of trustees rather than individual ownership. This provides continuity beyond any single person's lifetime and protections against seizure. Who would serve as trustees? Preston asked. Initially, the 5 of us. You, Margot, Ingrid, Yuki, and myself. Later, we can expand carefully. The trust would have strict confidentiality requirements, decision-making protocols, succession planning. Simon pulled out his tablet, showing organizational charts. I've established 17 similar structures. They work, but they require commitment from everyone involved. Preston looked at the 4 people gathered in the study, a geneticist, a sanctuary operator, a legal expert, and Margot, descendant of guardians stretching back centuries. A month ago, he'd been alone, overwhelmed, uncertain. Now he had allies. There's one more thing, he said. A covenant that every guardian has signed since 1723. He retrieved the document from Cornelius's desk, yellowed pages covered in signatures spanning generations. Each guardian had signed and dated their commitment to protect the sanctuary above personal interest. Margot's grandfather was the last to sign in 1962. I added my name last month. Preston looked at each of them in turn. If we do this, if we truly become trustees of this work, we all sign. We commit not just legally, but personally to what Cornelius began. Ingrid stepped forward first, reading the covenant carefully. The words were simple. I pledge to guard these lives and this knowledge, to value preservation over profit, to act always in the interest of the species protected herein, and to train my successor in these same principles. She signed without hesitation. Yuki followed, then Simon, each adding their names to the centuries-long record. "Now we begin the real work," Simon said. "Legal frameworks, genetic programs, habitat planning, financial sustainability. This won't be quick or easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Preston replied, looking at the signatures old and new. "But we're not working alone anymore." Outside, the rain had stopped. Spring sunlight broke through clouds, illuminating the study where 5 people stood, united across continents and disciplines by a single purpose: ensuring that what had survived in darkness for 2 centuries might someday return to light. 6 months later, Preston stood in the sanctuary, watching the newest generation of ibis chicks take their first tentative steps. 4 healthy offspring from the spring clutches, each one a small miracle of continued survival. Percy supervised from his perch with the authority of a patriarch, while Ingrid made detailed notes about developmental milestones. The castle had transformed around him. The East Wing now housed a small laboratory where Ingrid conducted genetic analyses during her monthly visits. Yuki had helped design improved habitats that allowed more natural behaviors while maintaining security. Simon's legal frameworks were in place. The sanctuary officially existed as the Ashford Conservation Trust, protected by layers of legal protections that would outlast any individual trustee. Preston himself had changed more than he'd expected. The desperate man who'd arrived with nothing had found purpose that went deeper than architectural preservation. His days followed rhythms set by living creatures rather than construction schedules. He woke to bird calls from below, spent mornings maintaining systems, afternoons documenting observations, evenings reading Cornelius's journals and adding his own entries. The work had given him back more than purpose. It had taught him trust. Margot visited daily, her energy renewed by seeing the sanctuary thrive under proper care. Together they'd opened the remaining sealed chambers, one containing preserved botanical specimens, another holding intricate drawings of ecosystem relationships Cornelius had observed. Each discovery added depth to their understanding of his vision. "Your ancestor was a systems thinker," Ingrid had observed during one excavation. He understood that species don't exist in isolation. He was trying to preserve entire ecological relationships. That insight had shaped their forward planning. They weren't just protecting individual species anymore. They were documenting the knowledge Cornelius had preserved about how those species interacted with their environments. Preston climbed the stone steps to the study, where afternoon sun illuminated dust motes dancing in golden light. His laptop sat open on the ancient desk, a jarring combination of old and new. He'd been writing, not architectural proposals, but something more personal. A memoir, perhaps, or simply an extended journal entry for future guardians. His phone buzzed with a message from Yuki. Habitat site in Andalusia, looking promising. Local government interested in Link's reintroduction program. Still years away, but moving forward. Preston smiled. Years away was fine. They were thinking in generations now, not months. A knock at the castle door pulled him from his thoughts. He found Aldridge standing on the steps, camera bag over his shoulder but face serious rather than excited. "There's interest," Aldridge said without preamble. A documentary producer heard rumors about significant conservation work in this region. Nothing specific, but they're asking questions. Preston's chest tightened. "How much time do we have?" "Hard to say. Months. Maybe a year before speculation becomes investigation. Simon thinks we should consider controlled revelation, announce the sanctuary's existence on our terms before someone else does." They walked the grounds while discussing options. The spring gardens Preston had begun restoring showed green promise. He'd discovered he enjoyed working with living plants, coaxing beauty from neglect, much as he'd once restored buildings. "I used to think preservation meant keeping things unchanged," Preston said, pausing by a stone wall covered in climbing roses. "But everything alive changes. The birds in that sanctuary aren't the same species Cornelius saved. They've adapted, evolved through 30 generations of cave life. True preservation means allowing that change while protecting the essence of what matters. "So what do we do?" Aldridge asked. "We prepare. We document everything, strengthen our legal protections, identify trustworthy scientific partners. And when the time comes, when we're truly ready, we share what Cornelius built. Not as a spectacle, but as an example of what's possible when people commit to protection over profit." That evening, Preston descended to the aviary one final time before sleep. The birds were settling for the night, their soft chirps echoing in the vaulted space. He sat on the stone floor where he'd first knelt, in overwhelmed wonder, and pulled out his Guardian journal. 6 months since opening the sanctuary to allies, he wrote. The work continues, larger now but no less sacred. I understand why Cornelius chose secrecy. In his time, revelation would have meant destruction. But times change. The question he posed about whether the world was ready for this knowledge remains complex. But I believe we're closer to that readiness than we've ever been. I came here broken, believing I'd lost everything that mattered. What I found was something that mattered more than everything I'd lost. Purpose isn't found in what we own or what we achieve for ourselves. It's found in what we're trusted to protect for others, for future generations, for species that can't speak their own value, for visions that outlast individual lives. I'm no longer the man who arrived 6 months ago with an eviction notice and nothing left to lose. I'm a guardian in a line stretching back 3 centuries, part of something larger than myself. The castle I inherited isn't a curse or a burden. It's a responsibility I'm honored to carry. To the guardian who reads this after me, you've inherited not just a sanctuary but a community. Trust them. Learn from them. Let them carry some of the weight that seems impossible to bear alone. Cornelius thought he had to work in isolation, but his greatest achievement wasn't the sanctuary itself. It was inspiring generations of people to dedicate their lives to continuation of his vision. The birds below me are settling for sleep, unaware they represent 2.5 centuries of human dedication and love. They simply exist, as they should, their survival a testament to what's possible when people choose protection over possession. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but tonight, in this moment, everything is exactly as it should be. Preston closed the journal and set it beside Cornelius's volumes on the laboratory shelf. His handwriting looked small next to his ancestors' elegant script, but it belonged there nonetheless. Upstairs, the castle waited, no longer empty and forbidding, but alive with purpose. The village below held allies rather than fearful strangers, and deep in the earth, species that shouldn't exist continued their quiet, miraculous survival. Preston Whitmore, once architect and now guardian, climbed the stone steps toward home, carrying forward a legacy that would outlast them all.